Okay, Chapter 25, Environmental Law, Part 4. This is the last part, a very short part. Another law at the federal level is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It authorizes the EPA to issue regulations for the monitoring, transporting, storage, treatment, and disposal of hazardous substances. The Act requires all producers of hazardous waste materials to label and properly package any hazardous waste that must be transported. There you see the penalties, $25,000, and also potential criminal penalties. The Superfund, this is an important environmental law. The Superfund was created for situations where there were huge environmental damage caused by industry or other actors in that area. If you read, you'll probably read history. You'll probably read about Love Canal. I believe it's in New York, which is one of the first areas where huge amounts of pollution essentially caused a huge environmental disaster for people living around those areas. So Congress passed this law called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, which is commonly known as a Superfund. And what this law does is it regulates the cleanup of disposal sites in which hazardous waste is leaking into the environment. So what it does is it puts an economic burden on those who have participated in the cause of that pollution, that money going into the federal government, which then uses the money to clean up those sites, which usually takes a lot of money, multi-million dollars, and a long period of time in order to do so. It's a very strict law, and it has four primary elements. It establishes information and gathering analysis system that enables the government to identify chemical dump sites and determine the appropriate action. It authorizes the EPA to respond to emergencies and to arrange for the cleanup of a leaking site directly if the persons responsible fail to clean up the site themselves. It creates the Superfund to pay for the cleanup of hazardous sites using funds obtained through taxes on certain businesses, and allows the government to recover the cost of cleanup from persons who were even remotely responsible for hazardous substance releases. And that's an interesting provision. So here we go with how that works with that provision. Responsible parties, who can be potentially responsible. When release or potential release of hazardous chemicals from a site occurs, these people can be held responsible for cleaning up the site or paying the cost of it. The person who generated the waste at the site, or the person who transported the waste to the site. The person who owned or operated the site at any time of the disposal, or the current owner or operator, even if the current owner or operator had nothing to do with the contamination. So you need to be careful if you're buying property that may have previously been used in some way that could have created a chemical release into the environment. It's strict liability for potentially responsible parties and cannot be avoided through transfer of ownership. So they can go back after somebody generations ago who was responsible for polluting that area. And there's joint and several responsibility for those actions. Okay. Businesses can minimize their liability by conducting environmental compliance audits on its own on a regular basis. The EPA will waive all fines if a small company corrects environmental violations within 180 days after being notified of violations that do not involve pollution prevention techniques. It doesn't apply to criminal violations or to violations that pose a significant threat to public health, safety, or the environment. What are the defenses that the alleged polluter can assert? If it's an innocent landowner, the defense may protect the landowner who acquired the property after it was used for hazardous waste disposal. This landowner must not have had a contractual or employment relationship with the person who owned the land when the contamination occurred. This landowner has to show that there was no reason to know that the property had been used for hazardous waste disposal at the time that they acquired the land. And the landowner must show that he or she appropriately investigated the possibility of environmental hazards before buying the property at the time of purchase. Okay, so those of you who are interested in going into business and may buy land, these are 3 things that you need to look at before purchasing the land to make sure that you're protected from any environmental damage that may have occurred by a prior owner. And this can be very costly to you if you do not do these things to at least set up a defense. Of course, you probably don't want to buy land that's been polluted that way anyway. So these are things to keep in mind. So that ends chapter 25. Again, the magic word for chapter 25 is clean.